Have you ever wondered why Christianity has such an issue with evolution? Well, in two of his recent podcast episodes with professing Christians, Joe Rogan has asked these two questions to those individuals.
What are your thoughts on evolution? So as a Christian, what do you think about all this stuff? Like, what do you think about ancient hominids, Australopithecus, Neanderthals? Like, what was God up to with all this?
Now, this video is not a response to the answers that those individuals provided, but rather why there is such tension when it comes to the theory of evolution within Christianity, but also why there shouldn't be any at all. So let's dive right in. Now, I'm fully aware this is a very broad topic, and we certainly can't cover everything, but I truly believe that Genesis 1, 26 and 27, really 28 if you want to include that as well, is at the heart of this issue when it comes to Christianity and evolution. And this is what verses 26 and 27 say in Genesis chapter 1. It states, "Then God said, 'Let us make man in our image, after our likeness.' So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them." Now, in this video, I'm not going to focus on the us language from verse 26. That's for another video. What I do want to focus in on is the image of God and what, in fact, that means. Now, this isn't true for all of Christianity. There are certainly a lot of Christians that do accept the consensus view in evolutionary science. But when it comes to Christianity that is opposed to this idea of evolutionary biology, we can really break it down into two categories. The first category is going to be the young earth creationism view. And this is the view that the days in Genesis 1 are consecutive 24-hour periods of time. That's really the central theme of the young earth creationist view. And then it coincides with Earth and the universe being 6 to 10,000 years old, depending on how you count the various sets of genealogies within Genesis 1 through 11. And in this particular view, probably pretty obvious, but there is not enough time for evolution to have taken place. Evolution requires millions and billions of years. Therefore, in this view, it doesn't fit the biblical narrative. However, there's also old earth creationism, which does accept the consensus view in science on how old the earth and the universe is. So they're going to agree that the earth is roughly 4.2 billion years old and the universe is roughly 14 billion years old. However, when it comes to the evolutionary process, they're going to, broadly speaking, lay claim to a view known as microevolution, but not accept what they call macroevolution. And what that microevolution term means is more of an adaptation. In other words, you can get animals adapting, or certain kinds of animals, they'll pull that word out of Genesis, certain kinds of animals adapting over time, but you won't get a species to species change in what they'll deem as macroevolution. But when it comes to both young earth creationism and old earth creationism, really the heart of the issue is that in these views, the Bible did not describe an evolutionary process, but rather that God created human beings in the current state, aka modern human beings, that we are in now. And in addition to that, there is the idea that if modern human beings are the image of God, then evolution cannot be true because human ancestors or relatives, such as Neanderthals, Homo naledi, etc., would have to be as well. And so in this view, the image of God is all about appearance, or at least the large focus of it is that it is an appearance-based. However, what if there's something else going on here? What if it isn't about appearance? And what if, hiding within the English translation, if we dig back into the Hebrew text, we find something entirely different than appearance? That's what this video is going to explore. The first step in this is to explore what the biblical text explicitly states about the image of God. And we'll pull from both the Hebrew Bible as well as the New Testament writings for this. We'll start with the Hebrew Bible in Isaiah chapter 31, verse 3, which states, "The Egyptians are man and not God, and their horses are flesh and not spirit." So we can see the contrast here between flesh and spirit. So obviously, this is stating that God is a spirit. And then we have John 4:24. This is actually Jesus speaking in the Gospel of John, and Jesus states this, "God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship him in spirit and in truth." A fairly popular passage taken from the Christian New Testament. However, what both of these verses indicate is that God does not have a physical form, but rather God is a spiritual being. Now, I know there are plenty of passages that talks about God having human characteristics, such as Genesis 18, Exodus 15 of the Song of Moses, Exodus 34, there's Deuteronomy 4, as well as Ezekiel 1. However, while these passages do describe God as having human characteristics, this is what scholars have identified as anthropomorphic language. And one such scholar has even stated, anthropomorphisms in the Old Testament also do not argue for understanding God as concrete. Anthropomorphism uses embodied humanity as an analogy toward understanding God. Assuming Yahweh has a physical form requires an explanation for why humanity was created with genders that have absolute physical differences, rather than enforcing the idea that God inherently possesses. Now, this is taken from the Lexham Bible Dictionary, and what it is essentially stating is that Anthropomorphic language used to describe God is used so that the human audience can grasp a concept of God. Or, in fact, when God chooses to meet humanity, he can come in physical form as a man. But this does not mean that the appearance of God is actually mankind in nature. Now, I know that plenty of people are going to argue against this and perhaps push back based on the evolutionary view of both Israelite religion as well as the Israelite conception of God. But diving down that rabbit hole would actually take away from what we're trying to accomplish in this video in terms of the image of God language from Genesis 1:27. And so we'll save that discussion for another time. And now that we've seen that the Bible describes God as a spirit rather than flesh, we need to explore further what it means to be created in the image of something that doesn't have a physical form. And so if we look at Genesis 1:27, I've broken this up into 3 parts, and you'll see the color coordination here is for a reason. It says, "So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them." And you can see the asterisk by the word man. And this is because largely in my own personal experience, this is where you will hear that God created Adam. Right here in Genesis 1:27, and then Genesis chapter 2 and chapter 3 deal with Adam in the Garden of Eden and obviously Eve. However, if we dig a little bit deeper into the Hebrew text behind this translation, we're going to see something much different that should alter the way that we view this. And in order to show you this, rather than just tell you and have you take my word for it, I'm going to open up Logos Bible Software. Okay, so what I have pulled up here is I have the ESV translation of Genesis 1 on the left-hand side, and on the right-hand side, I have the Hebrew text. You can see verse 27 looks a little bit different. That's actually because verse 27 is the first poem within the Hebrew Bible, which is really interesting to think about. That to describe the creation of man, poetry is used. And you'll see certain words highlighted while I scan over the text. That simply indicates where that same word is being used. So if we look at verse 27, at least the first part of it, this is what we see. Vayivra Elohim et ha'adam. And this word ha'adam is the key word right here. You can see over on the left-hand side of the screen, the word man is highlighted because Adam is the Hebrew word for man. And that is why a lot of people will link Adam in chapter 2 to this Adam here in chapter 1. But you'll notice something different, and you can't see this in the English because it wasn't translated to the English, but this first little letter right here, this is the hey, and then it has the definite article underneath it. That's what this T looks like right here. And what this would literally translate to is the human. And I have another resource pulled up here. And this resource is Learning Biblical Hebrew. It's actually a textbook that a lot of universities or classes will use to introduce students to learning Biblical Hebrew. And we're in the section that deals with noun and adjective function. And you can see what I have highlighted right here is actually important to our understanding of verse 27 in chapter 1 of Genesis. This is what it states. The article, it's talking about the definite article, that word the that we looked at. So the the and the human. The article will not appear on vocatives that are proper names because proper names are definite by nature. Now, this is a little bit meaty way to say that if there is a proper name that is being used, such as the word Adam, you cannot, in biblical Hebrew, and this is the same for English, you do not place the definite article the in front of that name. You do not have the Sarah, the John, etc. It works the same way in biblical Hebrew. And so when we come back here, we look at this translation into English, where it says man, a better translation would be the human or humanity. And so what this is actually describing in the first part of verse 27 is this is when God creates humanity. And if we come back over here and we look at the second and third half of Genesis 1:27, we're actually going to see why that is the best translation. And the middle section states, in the image of God, he created him. Now you might ask yourself, wait a minute, time out. Isn't him singular? So this would actually be referring to Adam because it is a single person. And this again has largely played into why Christianity has thought of this as the creation of Adam. However, Hebrew is a language of gender. And so when we look at this word man or Adam from the first part of this verse, it is a masculine word. And so the grammar, when it is referring to the human or humanity, this middle section has to reflect that masculinity. And so it's translated within the English as him, although it is speaking of plurality, as in all humankind. And we can see this very clearly in the next section where it talks about male and female, he created them. So this them and also the male and the female indicates that there's more than one, but the them is where it indicates that we are actually dealing with plurality. Now that we've looked at verse 27 in context of the creation of humanity, let's move on to what in the image actually means. And in order to do this, we need to break down the Hebrew behind the English translation in the image. And you can see here on the screen, I've got the Hebrew B'Tselem. And I have this color coded for a specific reason. What you see in green here is the Hebrew letter bet, and it is the prefix, which is where we get the translation in. And then Salem is where we get image, although it literally means the statue. And this letter bet, this single letter, is the crucial point in understanding what being created in the image actually means. And within scholarship, they've actually identified this bet under several different names, and there's more than what I have on the list here. But some of the common names that you'll see referred to in articles and journals, etc., is the bet of essence or equivalence, the bet of identity, or the bet of predication. Predication is probably the most common one that you'll see. However, what's unique about this is that it denotes role or function. And that's going to be really important in understanding what it means to be in the image, because the word in is a preposition, but it can mean several different things. For instance, I can tell you what I'm writing in: Sharpie, marker, pen, pencil, etc. I can tell you the profession that I am in. I am in marketing. I am in sales. I am in advertising. So there are a lot of different meanings that the word in can denote. And we'll explore what this bet of predication means for the phrase in the image found within Genesis 1:27. Now, as I just noted, this bet of predication is going to denote role or function rather than appearance, and we can actually see this within the Hebrew text if we compare Genesis 1:26 to Genesis 5:3. In Genesis 1:26, we have, "Then God said, let us make man in our image, after our likeness." And then in Genesis 5:3, you actually see the reverse of this. You see, when Adam had lived 130 years, he fathered a son in his own likeness after his image and named him Seth. What you can see here, all of the color coding indicates what preposition is being used. And so in the case of Genesis 1:26, again, there's that bet in our image. And then you have the Hebrew letter kaf after our likeness. And then you get the reverse of this in Genesis 5:3, where it is in the likeness, bet right there. And then after the image, you have that kaf with the word salem in that instance. However, there is a bit of a curveball within this discussion, and it has to do with the way that Genesis 5:1 is worded. So we just looked at Genesis 5:3 being in his own likeness after his image, that being when Adam fathered Seth. But in Genesis 5:1, we actually get this. When God created man, he made man in the likeness of God. And so when we compare that to Genesis 5:3 and also Genesis 1:26 that we just looked at, it does appear that all of these various combinations, in the likeness, after the likeness, in the image, after the image, could be synonymous. And you actually could make the argument from this that the image of God does refer to something external or visible in form. And this was actually the predominant view beginning in the 1940s, until biblical scholar David Kleins came along and provided some additional scholarship. And I'll get to his quote in just a minute, but I also do want to state that recent scholarship has noted that there is logical weaknesses in the idea that likeness, the Hebrew word demut, requires image or salem to be understood in visual terms. And that is because the terms are not always paired, and therefore it cannot be said that one is necessary to communicate the other. And it also suggests that their meanings are not completely synonymous. Now, this is a paraphrase of David Klein, specifically talking about these verses, Genesis 1:26, Genesis 5:1, and Genesis 5:3. It's a little bit meaty, so I'm going to break it down, but I did want to provide the full context for this. When the reference is to the image of God and not Adam's image, as in Genesis 5:3, the preposition with salem is always bet. This could be accidental, but we suggest that it is not. Genesis 5:1 and 5:3 do not speak of the transmission of the divine image, for it belongs to man as such, and so cannot be transmitted, but of Seth's likeness to Adam. And he goes on and says, Adam was made in the likeness, which is the same thing as according to the likeness of God. Thus, verse 1 has bidmot and not betsalem. Seth is not Adam's image, but only like Adam's shape. So verse 3 has not betsalmo, but ketselmo. Thus, Genesis 1:26 is not to be interpreted by Genesis 5:1 and 3, but vice versa. And so to break down what David Kleins is stating in a little bit simpler terms, we looked at the bet of predication earlier and how it denotes role or function. And so in this sense, the preposition in from Genesis 1 should be understood as meaning as or in the capacity of. So in other words, humanity was created as the imagers of God. Humans are created as God's imagers. They function in the capacity of God's representatives. And the way that's really helpful to think of this is if you think of image as a verb rather than a noun. If you are imaging something, the image of God is not a quality within human beings, but rather it is what human beings are. Now, it's also worth mentioning Genesis 9:6, because Genesis 9:6 is a passage that actually deals with the consequences of shedding another human's blood. And this is what it says. Whoever sheds the blood of man, and this is that same word, ha-adam, that we looked at in Genesis 1. So this is all humanity. By man shall his blood be shed. For God made man
in his own image. And this is unique because here, imaging vocabulary is actually linked to childbearing. And scholars have recognized this to be the case. And what makes this unique in terms of the biblical narrative is that these events transpire much later in the Genesis 1 through 11 history than the events in chapters 1 through 3. And so this is a reference to human beings that are not direct creations of God, but rather human beings that will be born by natural human processes. And there's one individual that has summed this up really well when talking about humanity as the image of God. He says, God then placed humanity within his cosmic temple of creation. In accord with the sanctuary building pattern, humanity was the crown of creation because he was the final piece of the building project, the cult image. He was tasked to begin this role by guarding and serving the Eden sanctuary, Genesis 2:15, just as newly ordained priests in Israel were to guard the tabernacle during their first week, and that's a reference to Leviticus 8:35. Another thing that makes this really interesting, this image of God concept, is that throughout the ancient Near East, it was primarily and almost predominantly the case that it was only the kings who were viewed as being made in the image of God. And really the one major exception to this is a second millennium Egyptian text known as the Instruction of Merikari, in which all humanity is created in the image of the gods. But certainly the view that the biblical text takes on all of humanity being created in the image of God is unique to its day and time. And again, this is just to reiterate that being created in the image of God is about role and function. But this leads us to the question, if being made in the image of God does denote role and function rather than appearance, what does this mean regarding the evolutionary development of mankind? And the answer is, well, nothing. It means that humans at the time of the biblical story were uniquely chosen as the image of God to be the physical representation of God on the earth and to serve in the capacity of those who justly rule and have dominion. It's this high or royal priestly figure. And so evolution being true does not make the Bible false. And it does not mean that all ancestors of modern humans must be made in the image of God or as God's image. Because the image of God does not primarily mean similarity, but the representation of God who is imaged in a place where he is not. And furthermore, the Bible is not a science textbook. The biblical authors knew nothing of biology or modern science. And so perhaps it's best that we as a modern culture and a modern people stop attempting to read or interpret scientific understanding into the text and make the text something that it was never intended to be, and try and answer questions that the original authors were never intending to answer. And I think this concept can be pretty well illustrated with these two images right here. Up top, we have Van Gogh's Starry Night, and on the bottom, we have the James Webb Telescope, their deep field view. Which of these images depicts the night sky? The answer is yes. They both depict the night sky, but they do it in a much different way. Van Gogh is focused on the patterns and the color schemes of the night sky, not necessarily being scientifically accurate with what the night sky looks at. But on the bottom, the James Webb, that is all about trying to reach out as deep into the unknown as we possibly can to grasp as much knowledge as we can within the universe that we live in. And these two images really represent ancient thought versus modern thought. Starry Night, obviously ancient thought, and then Deep Field as modern thought. But what ends up happening when we ask modern questions, or when we impose modern thought onto ancient texts, such as the biblical text, what we do is we end up creating a fairly pretty picture, perhaps, and shout out to whoever did this image. I'm not sure who did, but they did a great job. They really made a pretty picture with this, merging these two pictures together. However, you'll notice that if we're trying to analyze Starry Night in this, a lot of the details get lost because the James Webb image completely takes over the night sky. So you can hardly see the moon on the right-hand side, much less the stars in Van Gogh's painting behind those images. And this is exactly what happens when we impose modern thought onto the biblical text or ancient text in general. We won't see the details that the author intended the reader to see, and instead we dwell on the thoughts and issues that we self-impose. It cheapens the meaning of the text. It cheapens what the original authors have tried to do to it. And when we look at Genesis 1:26 through 28, this is designed in a brilliant literary symmetry that invites the reader to compare corresponding sections. And so what you actually have here is you have the image of God statements, and then they are immediately followed by sections that unpack the meaning and the significance of the divine image. So you'll see in verse 26, you have make human in our image, and then you immediately have and let them rule. And then in verse 28, you've got God blessing them, commanding them to be fruitful and multiply, and then telling them again to subdue it, to rule it. And in Hebrew grammar and syntax, when you have a verb of command or invitation called a jussive, followed by a clause that also has a jussive, it is meant to be understood as a purpose statement. And so this let us make human in our image in order that they may rule, this line, let them rule, and then in verse 28, when it repeats it essentially, well, not word for word repeat, but it does hit on the same concept. This "let them rule" is the purpose statement behind creating humanity in the image of God. And furthermore, it's an invitation to humanity to walk as royal priests who function as rulers over the creation, as the representatives of the divine being, of God. And so all of these items that we've discussed, the bet of predication, the meaning of the human in Genesis 1:27 to be understood as humanity as a whole, and God being a spirit from Isaiah 31 and John 4, rather than being a physical being or having physical appearance, have illustrated that the tension that exists between Christianity and science, and that's from both sides, doesn't need to exist. Because the Bible is telling a story, and storytelling is the history of humanity, and science is the history and ongoing process of discovery. So both science and Christianity can both be true simultaneously and be in harmony with one another. And as a final closing thought on this concept of what the image of God is, we actually see in the New Testament as well that this concept of being in the image of God is all about role and function. And this comes from words that Jesus is speaking in John 14 when Philip is asking Jesus to show us the Father. And this is how Jesus responds: "Whoever has seen me has seen the Father. How can you say, 'Show us the Father'?" And he continues on to say, "The Father who dwells in me does his works." And then continues on again, "Whoever believes in me will also do the works that I do." So you can see right here, there's this concept that Jesus isn't talking about if you've seen me, you've seen the physical appearance of the Father, what the Father actually looks like. He's rather speaking about seeing him in the image of God, directly correlating this with the works that he has done and also the works that his followers will do if they choose to believe in him. And I'm not trying to be theological here. I'm simply trying to demonstrate that this idea of the image of God being role and function based has been from ancient times all the way up into the 1st century with the Jewish people. It was a consistent thought pattern. In other words, it is only in our modern times that we are viewing the image of God language in a different way than the original authors intended. All right, everyone. I hope this video was both insightful and informative on the image of God. But I want to know what you think, so let me know in the comments below. And I'll be sure to link the articles that I used for this as well as some other resources pertaining to this topic. Thanks so much, and we'll see you on the next one.